Hi, everyone. My name is Tek Kim Pok, and I am a cultural producer here at the City of Sydney. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we are coming to you live from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to extend my respect and acknowledgement to elders past and present, as well as acknowledge those other First Nations attendees joining us in the event today here, and also from the virtual sphere. Just a little quick rundown on how the talk will flow today. We are recording today's talk, and we are exploring some ways in which the recording might be shared in the future. The best way to view the talk is to choose Fit to Window from the View Options drop-down at the top of your screen. Today, the talk is being interpreted in Auslan, and we thank our interpreters, Tina and Gail as well. There will be a moderated question session at the end of the talk. Please pop your questions into the Q&A feature for those watching from home, and we'll also have a roaming mic for the in-person attendees as well. If you are having any tech difficulties, please pop them in the chat, and we'll try and resolve them behind the scenes. And at the end of the talk, we have a short survey that will pop a QR code up for you to respond with any feedback, telling us what you enjoyed about the talk and any ideas you might have for future events. We'll also send a link out to those who've booked online to your emails. Just now I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, from the Brain and Mind Center, Dr. Jacob Crouse, speaking about mental health in a changing world. Please welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone. Okay. So my name is Jacob Crouse. I'm a research fellow from the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney. And I'll be talking about mental health and changes in mental health and relationships to wider factors that are changing in our world. Next slide, please. And I'm going to focus, I come from a youth mental health and technology team, so I'm going to focus a lot on young people because young people seem to be in trouble with their mental health at the moment. But a lot of what I'll talk about will be relevant to wider audiences. Next slide, please. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Gadigal people. I work on Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge that Australia's First Nations people are undergoing very unique struggles. And I'm not an expert on this topic, so I won't be discussing it today, but I can point people in the direction of some experts and resources if they're interested. Next slide, please. So I come from the Brain and Mind Center. There's a QR code here if anyone wants to scan this to get a sense of what our team work on. But the Brain and Mind Center is a multidisciplinary initiative at the University of Sydney, so brings together a whole bunch of different teams working on diverse areas, aging, neurodegeneration, youth mental health, technology, and trying to bring together different disciplines where we can hopefully solve some major issues facing society. And my team, the Youth Mental Health and Technology team, work very closely with some services that help young people with emerging mental health problems. So Headspace Camperdown and Mind Plasticity are two services we work very closely with. And we have a lot of young people coming through these clinics to access our services. Next slide, please. So today's talk, I'm going to talk about the burden of mental health problems in early life. And this will be clear for a few different reasons. I'm going to talk about mental health on our 24-hour planet and why it's important that we live on a 24-hour planet. I'll talk a little bit about mental health and climate change and relationships to the way in which climate is changing and how people are being affected, and then some emerging models of mental health care that our team particularly work on. So, burden of mental health problems in early life. So these figures still kind of shock me, but we now know from a number of very large international studies that a mental disorder will affect most people at some point in their life. So for a lot of people, they'll meet criteria for a mental health condition like depression or anxiety or psychosis at some point in life. And for a lot of people, this will just be kind of a short-term limited problem. They'll meet criteria, but then they may get better and then not be affected again. But for a lot of people, these things come on and then they're affected for their whole life. So in green, we have these studies that are large epidemiological studies that ask people about their current mental health and ask people to think about their mental health in the past. So kind of asking people to remember how they felt at different times in life. And we see from these studies that a little less than half of people who are surveyed will meet criteria for a mental disorder. But then in studies that follow people going forward, which are more likely to catch some of these mental health conditions over time, we see that the numbers are much higher. So these studies in purple follow typically young people over time through adolescence, and they find that over half or up to 3/4 of young people will meet criteria for a mental disorder. And then these studies in orange are birth cohort studies. So they follow a population of individuals from the time they're born, and they follow them going forward. And they find that upwards of 80% of people will meet criteria for a mental disorder. So these problems aren't rare. They affect most people, and they come in different flavors. So some people will be affected for a short time and then get better, and others will have a lifelong condition. Next slide, please. And we know from very good epidemiology that these problems tend to emerge when people are young. So around 1 in 5 adolescents will have a mental disorder that will persist into adulthood. So these are different mental health conditions that are quite common and that emerge when people are young. So things like ADHD and conduct disorders tend to emerge in childhood, anxiety disorders around childhood and early adolescence. Mood disorders tend to strike around adolescence and young adulthood. And down the very bottom, you see that any mental illness typically emerges around the age of 15. So about 50% of all mental disorders emerge by the time someone's 15, and around 75% by the time someone's 25. So these are really serious problems that are striking people when they're young and really starting their lives, starting university and work. So it's a really big problem for young people. And then as people get older, many of these things continue to affect them. Next slide. So a couple of years ago, the US Surgeon General declared that there was a youth mental health crisis. So we already had a problem with young people's mental health, but now it's worse than it was previously. And some of this is to do with events like the coronavirus pandemic, but there are other factors that are at play, and there are a whole series of factors that are responsible for mental health problems in young people, and at different levels. So we have problems at the level of the society, so inequality, discrimination, racism, new and emerging media and technology, social media for some people, factors at the level of the environment, so how safe is a neighborhood, how much pollution is around, natural disasters and climate change, at the level of the community, so people's relationships with peers and their friendship groups and social networks, levels of the family, relationships with parents and family members who might have mental health problems themselves, exposure to trauma, domestic violence, and then individual factors too, so age and someone's genetics. And it's important to say that these different factors all interrelate. So it's never one thing. It's very often times a matrix of different factors coming together for a particular individual. Next slide, please. And we have new data to show that in recent times, mental health has gotten worse. So this is a study just out this month in about 20,000 Australians who have carried out a bunch of surveys. And these graphs show on the left different age groups. And kind of as you go down the chart, that indicates worse mental health. And you can see that the darkest color is young people aged 15 to 24. So really young people are kind of dropping off in terms of their mental health. And then on the right, you see these same findings, but in more recent birth cohorts. So children who were born in the 90s and the 80s seem to have worse mental health than previous generations. So there are these new factors that are at play that seem to be affecting young people in particular. Next slide, please. And there are many reasons for this. This is kind of a complicated slide, but I really wanted to show that adolescent development and brain development is very complex, and there are a number of reasons why things can go wrong. So this graph shows kind of along the bottom the lifespan, so going from conception to birth and all the way to death, which looks like it's around 80 here, which is a little bit rough, but people are living longer these days. And each of these kind of waves is a different wave of brain development. And you can see that, you know, in childhood, we have these developments of functions like seeing and hearing. So children are learning to interact with the world and really absorbing information. As they get a little bit older, there's development in brain regions involved in speech and expression of speech, but also understanding of speech. And then the higher cognitive functions, so things like being able to make decisions, to weigh up different alternative scenarios when making decisions, making judgments, paying attention. These things develop right into adolescence. And this figure is from about 15 years ago, and it's a little bit outdated. We now know that a lot of these cognitive functions actually develop much later. So probably up to age 25 is where adolescence kind of finishes. So a lot of teenagers get a hard time for the way that they behave, but it comes down to their brains aren't quite wired up just yet. So teenagers get a hard time, but many of them can't help it, as their brains are still kind of being wired up. And since we have these kind of dynamic processes going on, there's this notion of moving parts break. So moving parts in a car are the things that tend to break because there's more kind of going on. So in these periods where we have really active brain development and social development, it's more likely that things will kind of come apart because things are developing. Next slide, please. Now, I've talked a bit about some kind of environmental and social factors, which I'll go into in more detail in the rest of the talk, but I just want to note that genetics do play a major role in mental disorders, but it's much more complicated than we used to think. So researchers used to think that we'd be able to find kind of single genes for mental disorders. So there was a depression gene or a schizophrenia gene, but we've learned that it's much more complicated, and that most illnesses are polygenic, which just means that there's a whole range of genes that are involved. So on the left, researchers studying thousands of people have been able to find 30 different genetic variants associated with bipolar disorder, and about 178 for major depression and almost 300 for schizophrenia. So there's many genes going on. And as we have larger samples of people in these genetic studies, we're finding more and more genes. So it's a very complicated picture. And the graph on the right shows how many people are in these studies. So say for major depression, we've been able to find 178 genetic variants, but this requires having over 100,000 people in the study. So we really rely on huge samples of volunteers from all around the world who can give like a saliva sample or something so we can look at their genes. So these numbers increase each year, but it just shows how complicated the genetics really are. Next slide, please. And related to this, since we have mental disorders that are polygenic, so there's many genes involved, that means that everyone in this room and everyone in the world carries some genetic risk. But it's a question of crossing a threshold where if you have enough of these genes and maybe you have certain environmental things that happen to you, that pushes you over the edge. But we do all carry some genetic risk. It's a bit of a numbers game. So these are some kind of normal distributions, which show in blue a control population, and then in yellow, a sample of young people from our clinic at the Brain and Mind Center. And these are young people that are seeking help for their mental health. And when we identify these different genes, we can kind of count them all and then give someone a personal genetic risk score, which says, for this individual, this is your genetic risk of depression or schizophrenia. And this does tell us a little bit about whether they're going to go on to develop something, but it's a complicated picture. And this just shows that when we have a group of young people who have mental health problems, they are shifted in terms of their genetic risk. So they do have more genetic risk. So we're increasingly able to kind of pick up on some of this risk using these new technologies. And I'll finish this section by saying that the brain is inside the body. Many people think of our mental health and physical health as being two separate things, but our brain talks to the rest of our body and our body talks to our brain, and mental and physical health problems are intertwined and interrelated. So this is a study of, I think, 5 million people in Denmark. So certain countries are very good at keeping registers of large groups of the population. And what this shows is that when someone is diagnosed with a mental disorder like schizophrenia or a mood disorder or an eating disorder, they're much more likely after that to go on to develop a physical health problem, and across a number of different systems in the body. So problems with the heart, with the liver, they're all increased in people who have a mental health problem. So we need to think about the mental and physical components together, and also focus on improving people's physical health who have a mental health condition. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, so mental disorders are very common. They will affect most people at some point in their life. And for some, it'll be a kind of a short-term problem, and for others, it'll be lifelong. And they tend to strike early when people are young, during childhood and early adulthood, and which causes huge problems as people are kind of developing during these periods. And they can really have lifelong impacts, which means we should really focus on young people for a lot of our efforts to try and prevent these problems. It's complicated. There's a whole mix of interrelated, interacting factors at the level of the individual, the society. It's never genes or environment. It's always genes and environment. These things play out in complicated ways. And there's data that says that mental health, especially in young people, is getting worse. So we need to rethink kind of some of the things that we're doing. Access to treatment has gone up, but people are still getting worse. So why is this? I'll talk about some potential reasons for this. So this section is going to be about the body clock and relationship between the body clock and mental health. And this is really relevant to all humans. So next slide, please. So people have known about kind of there being rhythms in nature, things that are predictable. And, you know, we have seasons, the sun rises and the sun sets. Animals come out at certain times of day. The groundhog comes out, says that winter is going to be longer. And there was a famous botanist, Carl Linnaeus, who came up with this idea of a flower clock. So he apparently planted different flowers in a garden, and he knew that they would open and close at different times of day. So he could kind of walk out into his flower clock and tell what time of day it was based on what plants were open and closed. So people have known about some of these rhythms for quite a while, but they didn't, we only recently are understanding how these things work. Next slide, please. So about 300 years ago, another botanist, I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but a Frenchman came up with this idea of testing whether some of these rhythms that were found in nature were just responses to the environment, or whether they were maybe generated by a clock that was inside of the organism. So he used this plant called a Mimosa pudica, which is a sensitive plant. So if you touch it, it kind of withers away, and it would open its leaves and kind of look like it was going to sleep at nighttime. And he thought this was related to the rising and falling of the sun, but didn't know if it was just a response. The sun comes up and the plant opens up, or potentially if the plant had a clock inside of it that was generating rhythms. So he kind of did a simple experiment where he put the plant inside of a dark room that didn't have access to the light dark cycle, so the rising of the sun, setting of the sun, and saw that the plant kept doing its thing. So it kept opening and closing kind of in a 24-hour rhythm, which suggested that the plant has a clock or a series of clocks inside of it, kind of controlling its behavior. Next slide. And now we know, this is very well established, that basically all life on Earth does have a series of clocks inside of them. We call them circadian rhythms. And circadian means around a day. So we live on a 24-hour planet. Kind of the most predictable feature of life on Earth is that the sun rises and the sun sets at a very predictable rhythm. So essentially all life on Earth evolved within it a timekeeper, a circadian rhythm that it could then use to organize the time of day that it does different things. So this is why we get hungry at certain times of day, and why we wake up at certain times of day and go to sleep. And people vary from each other. We have night owls who prefer kind of a later schedule. They like to sleep in and go to bed late, and this is a biological phenomenon. And then there are morning larks who prefer the opposite. They like to get up early and kind of get out the day, but this is all biologically driven. And we now know that this circadian system kind of regulates most of our behavior and physiology. So in this figure, at the start of the day, we start to secrete certain hormones that kind of promote being active, and we start secreting insulin because we know that a meal is coming soon, and we peak in how alert we are in the early morning. This is kind of for the average individual. We all vary. Most people are kind of strongest and fittest in the early evening. And then as night comes, we start to kick in kind of repair processes. So we have this really predictable set of behaviors and physiology that are programmed into each of us. And actually, the clock that's inside of each of us isn't exactly 24 hours. It's either longer or shorter. The average human has a 24.2-hour clock, which means that it needs to be reset each day to kind of keep in time with the 24-hour cycle of the Earth. Next slide, please. So we now know that the master clock is in our brain. It's in an area called the hypothalamus, which is involved in regulating a whole series of functions, our temperature, our appetite, and it sits in our brain, and that's the master clock. And we can kind of think of this as the orchestra conductor. So we have rhythms throughout our body, but the master clock is kind of in charge of this. And the most important thing to set the master clock, to tell it what time it is bright light, which is a really interesting and fascinating phenomenon that that our light exposure potentially impacts our health and well-being. Next slide, please. So this is a really clever experiment where someone has taken an enzyme from a firefly, and that enzyme gives the firefly the ability to light up. And they've put this inside of seedlings to show that these seedlings have this rhythmic 24-hour pattern of different things coming on in their body with this really rhythmic cycle. And this has been done in different animals and organisms to show that we have these rhythms of when things kind of turn on and turn off inside of us. And we have this brain clock, which is kind of the master timekeeper, but in reality, basically all of the clocks in our body, all of the cells in our body have a clock inside of them. And they're regulated by the master brain clock, but they can also kind of come out of time with each other, which can maybe lead to problems if your kind of liver clocks are functioning at a different time to your brain and things like that. These circadian rhythms really play a role in basically all human physiology and behavior and aspects of our well-being. Next slide, please. And our clocks can come out of time. This is called circadian disruption. And most of us would have experienced this when we go overseas and we have our clock that's maybe on Sydney time, and then we transplant our clock to Los Angeles and we feel crap. Common complaints when someone's jet lagged is they're tired, they're irritable, they can't fall asleep, they wake too early, they have problems with their digestion, they can't remember things. And the reason for this is because they've kind of confused their body's clock because they're in a new time zone, in a new light-dark cycle, and the brain and body clocks are just having a hard time syncing up. And like I said before, the body clock is flexible, so it does adapt to changes. So typically for the average person, it takes about 1 day for every hour of time zone change. So after a little bit of time, you kind of catch up and you start to adapt to your new time zone. But interestingly, a lot of people that we see with depression talk about feeling jet lagged all the time. So they report many of these problems. And when we look at their body clocks using different techniques, it kind of looks like they're jet lagged. So they're living in one time zone, but their brain and body clocks seem to be a little bit shifted. And this might be explaining some of the reasons for their mental health problems. And a lot of the aspects of modern life kind of cause us to have a bit of a jet lag type problem in our own time zone. So exposing ourselves to light at the wrong time of day seems to be really important. It's something that a lot of people don't know about and don't think about. Next slide, please. And we know that having a circadian disruption is really bad for our health. It affects many different systems in the body and is relevant to different problems at different times in life. So these are a whole series of health conditions that are relevant at different times of life. So along the bottom line is kind of increasing age. And we think that circadian disruption can contribute to all kinds of things. So in children who are, their body clock is still getting wired up, they have, mood swings and irritability. In kind of teenagers and young adults, they can have fragmented sleep, inflammation, mood disorders, and then in older adults, potentially links with things like cancers, Alzheimer's disease. So circadian disruption is something that every human should really be thinking about. And there are ways that we can maintain a healthy body clock, which I'll talk about soon. Next slide. So one of the biggest contributors that is kind of a new feature of modern life is the ability to turn on lights when the sun's down. So really helpful invention in terms of being able to get things done, but there are huge health effects to having access to artificial light at night. So I just searched up the Sydney area on this website that shows light pollution at night. And Sydney's really lit up at nighttime. And this kind of tricks our body clock into thinking that it's daytime because we didn't evolve with the ability to be exposed to bright light. When humans were evolving, the best we had was maybe fire at night, which is a really low kind of level of light. But now we just have these super brightly lit homes, and this tricks our body clock into thinking that it's daytime, and then we kind of get mistimed. So a lot of studies now show that higher light is associated with worse sleep. Many people probably know this from their own experience. It pushes our bedtime back, so it's harder to fall asleep because we're tricking our body clock. People don't sleep as long because then they've got to get up the next day to go to work. It's associated with increased risk of mental disorders, depression, anxiety, bipolar, and risk of physical illnesses too. So a lot of important things happen when we're asleep. Our brain and body are going through repair processes. But if we're kind of shifting the timing of these things, they're not being turned on, so we're not repairing properly when we're asleep. So artificial light at night, we're learning is a bad thing, but it's something a lot of us can control by making some kind of simple lifestyle changes. So next slide, please. And also in our own research, we have found that some of these body clock related factors predict how well people do in terms of treatment for mental health problems. So we have this idea of there being night owls and morning larks, and this is a natural phenomenon. It changes across the lifespan. So children start out in life getting up really early in the morning. That's because their body clock is just wired that way. And teenagers become more like night owls. Teenagers, again, get a lot of grief for wanting to sleep in late, but that's their biology. And then kind of changes as we get older to be a bit more morning-like. And people fall kind of in the middle. People vary. But there's data that shows that night owls are more prone to developing depression. We're not totally sure why that is. Potentially, it's because our society favors morning larks. So we have this 9 to 5 kind of schedule most people have to keep to. But for a lot of people who are night owls, starting work kind of falls when they should be, biologically sleeping. So we're potentially causing problems in those kind of people that might lead to things like depression. And we've got some data. Sorry, if you can just go back. Sorry. We've got some data that shows in about 15,000 Australians with depression, kind of across the whole lifespan, that common antidepressant drugs like SSRIs don't seem to work as well for them. And we don't really know why that is. We think it's maybe because night owls have a kind of depression that's caused by their body clock not being synced up properly. We don't really know, but they report that SSRIs and things like that don't work as well. So we're learning more and more about how we might tailor certain types of treatments to certain individuals. And this morning, this evening, this thing might be something we might need to consider. Yeah, next slide. So I'll talk about a couple of tips in terms of keeping a healthy body clock. And a lot of these things kind of harken back to how we maybe used to live before a lot of our kind of modern inventions. So it's important to, as best we can, keep a really regular sleep-wake schedule. And we think the most important thing is it's hard to control when you fall asleep for various reasons. Some people overthink at bedtime and can't kind of wind down. But what you can do is you can set an alarm in the morning. It's much easier just to get yourself out of bed. So we think that controlling the time that you wake up is probably the most important thing for keeping a really regular body clock. And a reason for that is that if you get out of bed and get into sunlight, we know that bright light is the most important thing to set the body clock. So it's a really regular signal. You know, you wake up, get out of bed, look at some sun for a bit, and that tells your body clock really regularly what time that is. So getting sunlight exposure early in the day, as early as we can. So in my own life, before I go to work, I'll go for a little walk, 10, 15 minutes, and just try and get some light. And I personally find that I can fall asleep easier that way, and I kind of feel a bit more energized. And getting regular sunlight exposure throughout the day, which might involve just getting outside for lunch and that kind of thing. And we think that the more sunlight you get during the day kind of reduces the negative impacts of getting light exposure at nighttime, so kind of offsets. So we do want to reduce our light exposure at nighttime. So this concept, I think if there's one takeaway from today, it's that we should have bright days and dark nights. So we want to get in the sun during the day, being sun safe, and turn the lights down low in our home. So using things like smart lights, which kind of you can program to turn off and turn on at different times, using certain apps that kind of dim the light on your phone, candles at night, that kind of thing. Kind of just tells your body clock that it's time to start winding down. And other kind of rhythmic, consistent routines like exercise and social interaction and meal times, trying to keep those regular, kind of gives a regular signal to your body clock. And you can kind of combine these things. So you might exercise outside with other people, and you kind of get multiple benefits from that type of thing. So in summary, so all life on Earth basically has evolved a biological timekeeping system. And you know, this goes back 300 million years. We see these timekeeping systems in really old organisms. And the circadian body clock system is really essential for our physiology and our behavior. And a healthy body clock is really critical for our health and well-being across all systems in our body. And circadian disruption is something that's become more common as many of us work in offices where the lights aren't bright enough during the day, or we're using lights at night. We're disrupting our circadian rhythms, but it's something we can change. And this kind of mantra of bright days and dark nights, and trying to live a bit like a monk, being kind of regular, is something that we can do to improve our body clock and our mental health and our physical health. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk really briefly about climate change. We don't do a whole lot of work in this area, but it's something that is topical and affecting people all over the world, and it's something that young people are really concerned about. So next slide, please. So there are many effects of climate change on a whole number of aspects of our physical health and our mental health. So for the whole problem with COVID, we had a big problem in Australia with bushfires. We kind of had one thing after the other. And these extreme weather events are getting more common. In Sydney, we're pretty lucky, but in other places in Australia and the world, there's increased flooding, heat waves, and these things do appear to be man-made in many ways, and becoming more common. And these huge events cause social dislocation. They separate families and communities. They destroy people's workplaces and livelihoods, destroying farms. And this leads to many problems that we know increase the risk of a mental health condition. So housing insecurity, losing a job, not being able to access education. Going back to the body clock issue, we know that rising temperature also disrupts our body clock. So we need to have a kind of drop in temperature to fall asleep. But when the temperatures are rising, this doesn't happen as readily. And this can really affect our ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. We know that increased temperature is associated with domestic violence. People are more aggressive. They use alcohol and substance use more. And there's a real issue in terms of people becoming anxious about climate change because we think that there have been really ineffective global responses to a lot of these problems. So a lot of young people are really concerned about their long-term futures, and this idea of eco-anxiety, so anxiety about ecology and the environment, and what's the rest of my life going to look like? Next slide. So this is an international survey from a couple of years ago, which focused on children and young adults from around the world, and asked them a series of questions about how they feel about the environment and climate change and their government's response to these issues. And these numbers reflect the percent of young people and children who are very worried about the climate. So kind of across all countries, about a quarter of young people are very, very worried, and many of them are impaired by this. They don't kind of know what the rest of their life is going to be like. And in certain places, you know, in the Philippines, as many as half of the children and young people who are surveyed about this are very worried. In Australia, it's about a quarter. So this is something that is topical and is affecting young people. Next slide. And zooming in on young Australians, this survey is on about 1,000 children and young people, and ask them about a series of negative beliefs that they have about the climate and how things are going. And 43% endorse that they're frightened by the future. Almost half talking about their family security being threatened. Most saying that they feel like their governments have had a poor response, and that people have failed to take care of our planet that we all share and that we all play a role in taking care of. And then around half endorsing things like things I value will be destroyed by the climate change, and humanity is doomed. I think a lot of people are feeling this way, not just in terms of climate, but broader world events. So I think a lot of these wider societal factors are contributing a lot to the development of anxiety and mental health problems in young people. And some of these things are getting worse. Next slide, please. So the last section I'm going to talk about is some of our own work at the Brain and Mind Centre and new ways that we're thinking about some of these problems. And I'll also close with some resources that people can access for more information and some tips. Next slide. So we, a few years ago, published in the Medical Journal of Australia a series of papers. There's a QR code if you want to have a look at this, but it's our own youth model of mental health care. And there are many problems with the way that international systems diagnose people with mental disorders. So, you know, there's the diagnostic label of depression, which we think in many ways is kind of useless for most people who have depressive symptoms, because it's just one label for a whole diverse range of problems that probably require very unique and kind of personalized treatment strategies. So we don't focus too much on diagnostic labels, and we have a real emphasis on using new digital technologies. So young people love kind of tracking their mental health using smartphones and that kind of thing. So we're trying to empower young people to enter in data about how they're feeling and kind of what's going on in their life, so that their clinicians can better track some of these things over time and be more proactive in terms of, if someone's looking like they're deteriorating, can we try and intervene before things get too bad, which isn't possible with these new technologies. Like I said, we focus less on diagnosis and more on potential mechanisms that underpin some of these problems. So we're really interested in body clock dysfunction. We think that it's really important kind of across the board, but we also think for things like depression and bipolar disorder, it's a really important potential mechanism that we're testing in some studies at the moment. And we take a broad, we call it a multi-dimensional view. So not just worrying about someone's diagnosis, but also looking at how are they functioning? Do they have friends? Do they have a job? Can we intervene and help in these areas? And we know that those factors, when they're improved, also lead to improvements in mental health. We focus on substance use and alcohol use and their physical health, and try and kind of bring all of these different factors together. And what we really want to do, which is hard work and we're not there yet, is to match the interventions we give people to that person's particular situation. So the way that current kind of diagnostic guidelines work is that someone with depression is recommended these certain interventions, like an SSRI or a particular psychological therapy, but we know that these don't work well for everyone, and that we're trying to develop new ways to look at a person's kind of particular situation and how we might better match what we offer to them to their situation. So one of the things that's a part of our model that's linked to this body clock issue is we've proposed that there's a subtype of depression, which we've referred to as circadian depression. So like I mentioned before, depression affects a whole bunch of different people in very different ways. They present with different symptoms. They respond very differently to different therapies. So there are very likely different kinds of illnesses or problems that all get kind of bunched together under the label of depression. So we've come up with this potential subtype called circadian depression, which we're trying to kind of test out at the moment. And there are different features that we don't see in everyone with depression, but we think are quite relevant to this subgroup. So seeing sleep-wake cycle abnormalities, so a delayed sleep phase. So they're more likely to be night owls. Their kind of sleep-wake schedule is shifted. Very often they sleep for a long time and they are quite inactive during the daytime. The timing of their sleep-wake cycle is very variable. So it changes from one day to the next, and kind of is more volatile and kind of bounces around. Very often they have low energy despite sleeping for so long, and prolonged fatigue. So, waking up in the morning and not feeling refreshed, feeling tired, their muscles are sore. And yeah, also some interesting symptoms like increased appetite and increased weight, which you don't see in a lot of people with depression. You see the opposite. So they don't have appetite, they're not hungry, or they're losing weight. We kind of see these differences. So this is something we've proposed, and many people disagree with it, and we're trying to kind of test it at the moment to look at, is this group, do they respond differently to certain kinds of treatment? Next slide, please. And we do think that this type of subtype might have clinical implications for how we treat people. So rather than just using one type of treatment for all people with depression, like a particular psychological therapy or a particular antidepressant, we think that targeting the body clock and sleep-wake cycle behaviors might be more effective in this group. So I've kind of got suggested these first line and second line psychological therapies, and then also medical therapies. So in the kind of first line psychological therapies, we think that cognitive behavior therapy that's focused on the sleep-wake cycle, so teaching people about kind of sleep-wake behaviors and different management strategies there, might be more effective in this group. Trying to get them to better regulate their sleep-wake cycle, like getting up at a regular time each day and getting exposure to bright light. There are also chronobiological treatments, which are treatments that affect your chronobiology or your circadian rhythms. So bright light therapy is a particular treatment that kind of requires someone to sit in front of a really bright screen that kind of simulates the sun. And they might sit in front of that for an hour to kind of set their circadian rhythm. So we think that those kinds of treatments might work better in people with this circadian depression. And then particular drugs that might affect the body clock. So melatonin is something that's really popular at the moment. So you have so melatonin's a sleep hormone that we all have. And melatonin kind of starts to be secreted when it's dark. So it's kind of a darkness hormone. So that's what's affected when we expose ourselves to bright light in the evening. We're kind of lowering melatonin, but we want it to go up. So you can give people melatonin in a tablet to kind of kickstart their melatonin rhythm. And I think in Australia, adults over 55 can get a certain kind of melatonin fairly easily. But we don't really know the long-term effects of it. It's a hormone, so giving it to young people there's still a big question mark next to that. But we've just been funded to do a clinical trial of melatonin, kind of short-term for young people with depression. And we think that it won't only improve their sleep, but it will also improve their other depressive symptoms. And we think that it will work best in this group that we've called circadian depression compared to other kinds of depression that are more about kind of anxiety and negative views of the self and that kind of thing. And then there are also other drugs that lithium is something that's used mostly for bipolar disorder, but there are stimulant drugs that kind of increase how awake someone feels. So we think those are potentially relevant to people who are really fatigued and tired. So a lot of this is kind of a model that remains to be tested, but we think this kind of direction will really improve a lot of the problems in the field at the moment. Next slide. So some resources. So my boss, Ian Hickey, is a psychiatrist who you may have heard on the radio and news. He's always out there spreading the good news. So he put out a book this year all about depression, kind of challenging some of the myths of depression. And there's a big focus on the body clock and some of these ideas I've been talking about today. So there's a QR code that can take you to a site to buy the book if you're interested. And in terms of free resources on the next page, Ian and James O'Loughlin, who's a journalist, have a podcast called Minding Your Mind, which they've covered a whole series of mental health related issues. They have 149 episodes now, covering a whole range of topics. So the importance of social connection, family dynamics, and they've got a Christmas special, which is relevant as we're all going into Christmas and having to deal with our families. Improving our our physical health to improve our mental health. Norman Swan, who's a well-known doctor, is featured on that. And a whole range of topics: religion, spirituality, what runs in families, genetics, burnout. Malcolm Turnbull, ex-Prime Minister, came on to talk about vulnerability. So there's a whole series of episodes that go into detail with a lot of what I've talked about and have a lot of practical recommendations. And they've summarized all of what they've talked about on the podcast in a book that came out last year, I think, which is, very kind of digestible way of getting the information out there. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So thank you all for listening. You're welcome to email me about anything, but I'm here for some questions too. So thanks very much.
Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, yes, I have a question. Great. I wrote it down.
Thank you.
Can you talk more about the 24.2 hour clock and how do we know that we have that and how do we adjust to that daily?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the 24.2 is the average human. And we know that by sending volunteers into dark environments where there's no light coming in. So I think the early experiments would send someone into a cave deep in the ground, and they would measure, I think in urine and things like that, the rhythms of different physiological factors. And somehow from that we get an idea of how long someone's internal clock is. But people vary. So people go closer to 25 hours, some people go less than that. And those are kind of genetic factors that are kind of causing those differences. Yeah, this for the timing of the rhythm for sure, but I don't know about the length, whether the length itself changes with age. Definitely the timing kind of across the lifespan. But yeah, I think we all live on this 24-hour planet, so the clock luckily is flexible. And certain drugs actually, like lithium, which is used in bipolar disorder, does affect kind of the length of your rhythm. So yeah, it does seem to be changeable in some ways. Yet to be unpacked though. Yeah.
Can you take lithium long term?
People do, yeah. People with bipolar do.
Does it affect you?
Well, I mean, for someone with a severe bipolar disorder, it's a miracle. Like, it affects them really positively. It's almost like a cure when they're taking it. They're very well, oftentimes. You do have to have a doctor that monitors. It affects certain parts of the body if it's taken kind of in too high doses, so it needs to be monitored. But there are studies that show that, not that we should all be taking lithium, but the amount, lithium's a salt, so it's natural in the world, and the amount of lithium in water is correlated with suicide rates in different populations. So more lithium in water, like natural kind of sources of water, is associated with less suicide in that area. So something going on there. Not sure what though. Yeah. I have no disclosures, by the way. No pharmaceutical. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Just a question in terms of some of the research that's been done. Has there been significant reduction in the mental disorders, like for young people, like for the, you were showing about the stimulants and the other things? Has that research shown that it's actually reducing?
In terms of the different treatments I was talking about?
Or is that still?
It's still, yeah, not so, we don't have good evidence in young people for those kinds of things. Typically, we fight for young people very strongly, but most studies in the world are focused on older adults, which is also good. But we don't know heaps in young people about, and things like modafinil, which is a stimulant that makes people feel more awake. It doesn't cure the problem. It kind of is if someone's really fatigued, it just makes them better able to function, that kind of thing. So yeah. But no, like we think our treatments are getting better in many ways and there's better access, but people are still doing worse, kind of on average. So yeah, much more to do. Yeah. Ava?
I have a question about sleep. What's the difference between deep sleep and REM sleep, and what should we be focusing on?
Yeah, that's a bad question for me. I'm not a huge sleep guy. More about the sleep-wake cycle. Yeah, REM sleep, as I understand it, is where a lot of dreaming happens. I think sleep is still a big mystery in terms of what it's actually doing. We don't know kind of the purpose of sleep. Seems to be some recovery. You consolidate memories during certain periods of sleep. So if you're not getting into that sleep state, you don't consolidate memory as well. Probably some of what we see during dreaming is our brain kind of figuring out what happened that day and trying to integrate things. Do you ask how we get better?
I actually, that's my next question. You were talking about the DNA factors of who is more susceptible to mental health. Let's say you are very susceptible to a lot of mental health problems. What does a perfect environment look like where you can, I guess, prevent a lot of those triggers in that sense? Yeah,
that's really complicated. I guess on one of my earlier slides where I had that whole list of factors, I don't know if there's a perfect environment, and it's all kind of based on probability, so it's hard to really tell what's going to affect a particular person. I think there are things that we can all do better to improve environments, better social connection and interaction, following some of these sleep-wake types of things. We can't do much about our genes at the moment. And also, sometimes more information is not better. So knowing your particular risk might freak you out if you're a high risk for something, so might not improve things. So we're trying to understand young people that we're seeing in clinics. If we know something about their genetic risk, can that tell us about where they're going to go? And can we maybe, if someone's really high risk, can we offer them certain kinds of treatments to prevent them getting worse? But yeah, I think it's just very complicated. So yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, you talked about how young people are now more at risk from mental health problems than ever. And a lot in the news, we're seeing that there's the detriments of social media for young people. Could you just shed light on whether that is a big factor, and how big of a factor is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I did have a slide, the Surgeon General who I talked about earlier, in his report had a big section about social media, and that social media should come with warning labels like we have on cigarettes, that they may cause harm. I think that's also very complicated. I think my understanding is that social media may amplify what someone's already going through. So if they're anxious, having access to, the terrible things that are going on in the world, kind of doom scrolling may make things worse for them. But I don't think it's necessarily causing, I don't know if it accounts for the big increase we've seen. Yeah, I think, for people with maybe at risk of an eating disorder, there are problems there in terms of comparing bodies and that kind of thing. But I think it probably just really varies by individuals. And technology is also a good thing. People connect using technology in ways that they might not connect out in the real world. So I think it depends. And there are some studies that say that social media has not contributed to the increase. But I think a lot of mental health professionals who are seeing young people and listening to stories aren't so sure about that. So yeah, not sure. Complicated. It's all complicated. Yeah.
One last question from online. How does daylight saving affect mental health?
Yeah, that's very topical. It does. There's a big argument from a lot of the chronobiology field that we shouldn't have daylight savings and we should keep kind of a standard permanent time year round. When we shift the clock, car accidents go up, emergency department presentations go up. So it's not just an hour of sleep that you lose that night, but your body clock then is out of sync. And it takes some time to kind of catch back up. So I think it does contribute in many ways. And yeah, certain parts of the world, I think in a big part of China, it covers a huge landmass, but they use the same time, like they're on the same time zone. So people on the East Coast and the West Coast have a very different light dark cycle, but it's the same time on the clock. So I think depending on where you are in the world, some of these things, daylight savings, can have big impacts. Yeah. But I think, the chronobiology field is pretty united on doing away with daylight savings for mental and physical health. Yeah. I get in trouble with family because people like sunny, warm afternoons. So. Cool. All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for all your wonderful questions. I'll just leave the talk here with this QR code up here for those people at home and those in the room. Please let us know what you think. questions that you want to ask the city, but also to convey to the speaker and the Brain and Mind Centre that'll help us inform any future programming. Thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon.